Hello, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenue tout le monde. My name is Nina Liaquino, and I am the Artistic Director of English Theatre here at the National Arts Center. Le Centre National des Arts est situé sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé de la nation Anishinaabe-Algonquin. English Theatre gratefully acknowledges all the storytellers, the stewards, the caretakers, the water protectors, recorded and unrecorded, who continue to host us on this land so that we, in turn, can keep creating and producing works and hosting important discussions such as these on our stages and inside this beautiful, significant building. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, early afternoonish, spending your Sunday, beautiful Sunday with us. I am going to be moderating this exciting panel titled The Culture Gap in the Climate Crisis. So here's the lowdown. Here's how this is going to work. I'm going to do brief introductions of our esteemed panelists. They're rock stars in the field. And then we're going to launch into kind of questions that'll hopefully kick off some hearty, juicy discussions. And then I'm also hoping that, whatever we talk about here really kind of inspires and piques your curiosity. So we're going to have a small kind of Q&A at the end with any of your questions and kind of impressions and insights on what we've just talked about. Sound good? Yes? Yes, thank you. So, yay, here we go. The very far, David Maggs in black. So David is an interdisciplinary artist and researcher focused on arts, climate change, and sustainability. He is also the artistic director of Camber Arts, which is a rural Canadian inter-arts organization. He was a former senior fellow in Germany at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Sustainability, and is currently, am I correct in that? Currently the inaugural fellow on Arts and Society at the Metcalfe Foundation. Their full bios, by the way, I'm not giving any of this any justice, I'm just doing the highlights. If you want to check them out, they're on our website. So, moving on, Vicky Stroich is the Artistic and Environmental Programs Manager at Caravan Farm Theatre, based in Armstrong, BC. She is also a dramaturg, both in the traditional sense and climate, and we'll unpack that a little bit later. She is a facilitator, a nonprofit leader, a community builder, and has worked with various theater companies and artists in Calgary, among which are the Alberta Eco Trust and Alberta Theatre Projects. So that is Vicky. And then, last but not the least, our very own Judy, English Theatre's associate producer for artistic programming and environmental projects. And you're going to unpack that title for us a little bit later. She is the co-conceiver and also the lead producer for Irresistible Neighborhoods, which is English Theatre's kind of environmental initiative, and you're going to talk about that as well a little bit later. She was the co-founder and former operations lead at SCALE, which is Sectorial Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency. Did I get that right? Yes. Looking at my cheat sheet here, which is a not-profit organization, like a network, so to speak, of artists, cultural practitioners, arts organizations committed to addressing the climate crisis. So there you have it, our three Genius Rockstar panelists for today. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, and David, you can address this first, but this is a conversation, so feel free to chime in. So I'm going to start where this all really began, as the title of this panel, The Culture Gap, the Cultural Gap in the Climate Crisis. So this was from an article, I guess, a title that you've written while you're a fellow at Metcalfe. What does this mean? Like, can you unpack that a little bit for us, and what are you getting at?
Right. Sure, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. It's nice to see you on such a great day. So I turned to this idea of the culture gap, really about trying to communicate what I used to call the arts-shaped hole in the climate crisis. And that term didn't take off with the kind of facility that I had hoped. And so started talking about the culture gap because there are a lot of really recognizable gaps in the climate crisis. And so if you say the technology gap, people are immediately quick to think about work that's being done on carbon capture and storage or on renewables or on other technologies that are necessary for closing the gap between where we are right now and a climate-friendly world. The policy gap is another one that's really familiar. We're seeing fought about all the time right now with carbon pricing and the axe the tax debate that's going on. The finance gap, as people are trying to calculate how much money it's going to cost, what's the size of investment that we need to get us from where we are right now to a climate-friendly world. And the other one that's really been, I think, a persistent preoccupation of climate activism is the knowledge gap. And what is it that people need to know, and the assumption that there's this big gap between what they know and that's keeping us from living in a climate-friendly world. And it's this last one that I've been working hard over the past decade to try and figure out how to distance ourselves from. So there's something of a preoccupation, a compulsion in our world to think that all problems can be solved with better information. And that if we just get the right information into people's heads and we create a change in their knowledge, we'll suddenly arrive at the world that we want to be in. And we have so much research and experience watching the way in which that is just simply not the case. You know, the famous knowledge-action gap is struck to describe the fact that changing people's knowledge does not change the kind of actions that we take, either individually or collectively. And so I wanted to try and find a word that captures the parts of ourselves that are really determining who we are and how we act in the world. Things like meaning and identity and value and belief and a sense of belonging and a sense of place. Those kinds of things are such strong forces in determining how we act, so much stronger than the information that we're carrying around in our heads. That determines how we act in the world. And I thought, you know, the thing that really engages with those pieces more than anything are the cultural practices of any society. That's what culture is for giving shape to and meaning to and structure around those dimensions of ourselves. And it's those dimensions of ourselves that have remained almost invisible inside climate action, that we've done so little work to engage with that aspect of ourselves, that it struck me as not entirely dishonest to say that the culture gap in the climate crisis is bigger than the technology gap and bigger than the policy gap and bigger than the information gap. And that's where we need to start putting a lot of our energy right now.
Yes, because it's intangible. In a sense, you can't measure that. So where does, and this is for anybody, you know, just a follow-up for that, David, so in terms of the culture gap, where does the arts then, within that, fit in climate activism?
It's such an important question because what typically happens if our society is so set up to work on knowledge gaps, that's what we're built for, right? The whole landscape of universities, for example, those are engines of information trying to close knowledge gaps all over the place. So, we are a culture that's evolved for a century, really working on how we close knowledge gaps in the betterment of people's lives. And so it's very, very easy to fall into the rut of trying to serve the knowledge gap. And so when the arts want to get involved in the climate crisis and they look at what they can do, the sort of, where there are lots of jobs being advertised, where there's a belief that there's a lot of work to be done, is in this idea of the knowledge gap. And so the arts typically start to move for that and start to work on that, and you get what's sometimes called infocentric art, or art that's meant to teach, a kind of didactic approach to the arts. And to me, this is a tragedy, because the one thing that we can do to engage one another without speaking through the channel of information is through our artistic practices. That, if there's anything that is really built to make culture, it's our artistic practices. The unfortunate thing that keeps happening is that instead of working in the culture gap, the arts get involved in the climate crisis and they start working on the knowledge gap instead. And we squander a huge opportunity to play a very unique role that's really best served and largely only served by our artistic practices.
So that being said, I think part of what Vicky and, for example, Judy, what you're doing with these really unique titles, and I'd say groundbreaking titles in theater companies, for example, you're a climate dramaturg, but you're the artistic and environmental programs manager. You are the associate producer of artistic programming and environmental projects. So, kind of just coming off of what David was saying about like the culture gap and addressing. So what do these titles mean, and how is it actively contributing to closing that gap, maybe?
So, hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. So I've been, like David and I and Vicky have been working together in different ways for 3-4 years. I think we started working together during the pandemic. And I've, come from a pretty strong, I've always worked in theater as a producer primarily, but I also have a pretty strong background just as an environmentalist, like in my life in general. And I've always kind of wanted to bring these things together. And during the pandemic, I had the opportunity to do that as some new movements were sort of gathering steam around like-minded people working in the arts who felt strongly that there needed to be a stronger role for the cultural sector and nonprofit arts in the climate crisis, that we needed to be doing more. And for me in particular, how that manifests is that, I'll just back up a second to say that a lot of that energy, the majority of that energy, flows towards operational questions. So, how do we recycle our sets? How do we reduce our energy footprint? How do we reduce the emissions of our activities? How do we reduce, from reduce our impact from travel and touring? We should be composting the cups in the coffee shop. Like all those kinds of questions, which are crucial questions, like absolutely. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that we shouldn't be engaging with those questions as a sector, but we can't stop there. Because the thing about that operational side is that, yes, it's very, very important, but it's no different than what every sector needs to be doing, like reducing their emissions and their environmental impacts as quickly and profoundly as possible. We all need to be doing that in every sector. So the more interesting question for me is, what is the unique proposition of our sector? What is our unique capacity in the arts sector that only we can do, like that only what we bring as artists and as art makers. So that was really, the question that's been driving a lot of my work for the last 3 years. And I've had the great privilege of working with Vicky and David here and many others who are also equally concerned about these questions. And here at the NAC, we, in September of 2023, we released our Environmental Sustainability Action Plan alongside our new strategic plan. That was a really big milestone, something I'm really proud of. That's a document that lays out all kinds of objectives and targets for the NAC over the next 3 years, predominantly operational, but there is also some parts of the document that talk about the artistic aspects. And my title, to get back to your question, Nina, is a reflection of those artistic aspects and a recognition that we need to be thinking about those artistic aspects alongside the operational aspects, and kind of a formal recognition of the work that I'd been doing over the past several years. So I'm pretty thrilled that that's now been formally recognized. And also, I just want to honor Vicky and Caravan Farm, because really, as far as we know, Caravan Farm was really the first Canadian nonprofit arts organization to create a position with the word, an artistic position with the word environmental in the job title. And I'm, anyway, just very privileged, and I feel very lucky to work with Vicky in that sense. So, yeah.
Vicky.
And I'll say that it's part of the reason that title was born was so that other people would take on that title. So I'm very privileged and honor what the National Arts Centre English Theatre has done in continuing that, because the more of us that are doing that, the more that it becomes integrated and the less obscure or strange it seems. And I'll speak a little bit to how the title manifests at Caravan Farm Theatre, and then I'll speak a little bit to climate dramaturgy. But Caravan Farm Theatre is a unique sort of place. It's an outdoor theatre that's existed on an 80-acre piece of land in the North Okanagan in British Columbia, on the traditional unceded territories of the Secwepemc and Syilx Okanagan people since 1978. So all of our art is environmental in a way because it's all in the environment. And some of it uses horses and other wildlife are flowing through the environment while the actors are. So we have always done work that is connected to land, connected to environment, but surfacing that and recognizing that more so than ever, allowing audiences and artists to reconnect with land, to reconnect with the environment, to feel that sort of sensory value of being in the natural world. That has to be foregrounded more and more and really integrated into how we think about the art we're doing, how we think about how the audience encounters it, and how to maximize that opportunity when you have a bunch of people gathered in a space that is ever changing. And it is ever changing, especially with climate change. We've experienced, people get a real firsthand feeling or experience of climate change when they're with us now too. So that role was meant to really surface and integrate and thoughtfully consider how we maximize the opportunity for people to connect with nature, connect with the environment, and think about the changes that they're experiencing through the work and through the experience of being there, because art is also an experience. Climate dramaturgy, which was sort of became a part of this project and was a consideration. I'll start by sort of giving folks who don't know the word dramaturgy a little dramaturgy explanation. Dramaturgy is a support function in the theater. A dramaturg is largely there to work with playwrights and creators as they're creating work. It's part process design, it's sort of part coaching, it's someone who's providing feedback, reflecting back what they're hearing in a piece to help the playwright, to help the creators to say what they want to say in the strongest possible way, and help them realize the vision they have for the piece that they're creating. And so so I've been a dramaturg my entire career, and this opportunity to be a climate dramaturg has largely been about looking at pieces that are creating and supporting processes for artists who are creating and want to connect with or speak about or explore climate change or the impacts of the changes in our society as a result of climate change, helping them to unlock certain pathways that help them find a way into it, help to give them some confidence in engaging with it, and also to reflect back on what I'm seeing in the work from a sustainability perspective, from a climate perspective, and really taking a look more so at that world building than and the impacts of the choices that they're making in the work on how people receive that world, than it is necessarily about say the story structure or the character choices, although those are all connected. And I had the good fortune to work with Rick Knowles on the Irresistible Neighborhoods productions as the dramaturg to my climate dramaturg, although we both obviously contributed to both aspects. We observed what we observed and reflected. So that's what climate dramaturgy is to me.
Perfect. And because you mentioned Irresistible Neighborhoods, then let's go there, because all three of you are connected to this initiative from English Theatre. So what is Irresistible Neighborhoods? Judy? How did it come about? What was the genesis? Like, how was it born?
I've told the story a few times, but I love to tell it, so forgive me for telling it again. It was shortly after you first arrived at the NAC as our new artistic director in August or September of 2022, 2 years ago. Yeah. It was one of our very first sort of big conversations as we were getting to know each other. And you told me about a new play development project that you wanted to launch at the NAC as a way of helping you to get to know Ottawa, your new adopted city. And I think you had a number of objectives with this project you wanted to launch. One was getting to know Ottawa neighborhoods. One was nurturing emerging playwrights. And one was revisiting the theme of, or the format rather, of radio plays, which you had a history of doing that at Factory, particularly during the pandemic, right? So I listened to all of that, got very excited, and said, well, I've been doing this work, with people like Vicki and David and a few others around climate and sustainability and the role of the artist in the climate crisis, and could we apply that lens to this new program and sort of use it as a testing ground or a pilot for this sort of framework that we've been developing around climate dramaturgy, and to actually test it out and iterate it and see how it works. And then you said yes. And that's how Irresistible Neighborhoods was born. And I can talk a little bit about sort of its evolution thus far. So when we first conceived of it, we didn't know how big it was going to get. We just started with 1 year. I think you mentioned, maybe we'll come up with like a whole library of radio plays and we'll do different neighborhoods every season or so on. But anyway, Volume 1, which is subtitled Ottawa 2044, we commissioned emerging playwrights from different neighborhoods here in Ottawa-Gatineau. And those pieces were developed over the course of 8 months with Vicki and Rick Knowles, who's with us here today. Hello, Rick. As our climate dramaturg and dramaturg working with emerging playwrights. And those pieces were recorded in our NAC Hexagon studio in May and released online as podcasts at the end of June. So that was Volume 1. And then, meanwhile, our good friends at the NAC Orchestra approached us about the Sphere Festival, on now, and said, would we consider doing another iteration of Irresistible Neighborhoods in conjunction with the Sphere Festival? And of course, we said yes, even though the time was extremely short. And we had like less than 6 months, I think, to come up with what is now become Walking on Water. So Walking on Water is Volume 2 of Irresistible Neighborhoods, and partly because the time was so extraordinarily short, we commissioned Simonovich laureate, David Yee, playwright who won the Simonovich Prize in 2023, along with Bernie Stapleton, who was nominated for the Simonovich Prize last year as well. So we have like 2 incredible playwrights at the top of their game who were commissioned to create the 2 episodes for Volume 2, Walking on Water. And then because this is a co-production with NAC Orchestra, the 2 playwrights were invited to bring a composer on board. And so we're truly, truly delighted to have Chris Thornborough and Dwayne Andrews working with us as the composers for the 2 pieces. And so in both cases, both for Volume 1 and Volume 2, the artists went through a 3-day orientation led by Vicki and Rick around that kind of introduces them to the whole framework that we started off, David talked about at the beginning. And that orientation is kind of the kickoff point for their creative process. And we're really, really curious to see how different artists respond to the prompts in the orientation and apply their own artistic voice to some of the ideas that are put forward to them in the orientation. And so in the case of Volume 2, we had the playwrights and composers going through the orientation together, and the development of the music alongside the text was highly integrated, which is, I think, one of the really exciting things about how Volume 2 came about. I'll stop talking in a second. I just want to give one more shout out because the other co-producer for Irresistible Neighborhoods for both Volume 1 and Volume 2 is our wonderful friends at NAC Digital Experiences and Design, who are here filming today. They've also recording both volumes for release as podcasts. So just wanted to give a shout out to them too.
That's great. And so, Vicky, like you did lead kind of for both volumes that 3-day orientation, where you were equipping. The way I see it, you were equipping these artists who have a lot of them have no experience in working in kind of the environment, climate justice, sustainability. They're artists. And so can you just kind of walk us through like a snapshot of like what that 3-day, how important was that 3-day orientation and kind of your observations where, again, art and climate kind of meet and the tensions around that and like the pitfalls and the challenges that you kind of observed, also went through like the anxieties as artists, such as me, like when we're like, okay, write a play, but write a play about climate change and sustainability. And again, we automatically default to knowledge gap versus like magic, which I think, if I am understanding you correctly, David, it is that actually more so than the hard knowledge gap where we fall into the doom and gloom, a play about recycling, or trees kind of deal. So can you just kind of walk us through? And David, if you have any, from that, where does a model like Irresistible Neighborhoods, kind of how does that inform kind of the rest of where art sits in your fight, I suppose? Yeah.
So the orientation, I call it going from information to inspiration. And I think that and part of the reason why I feel comfortable like taking on this orientation and this role is because I had to go through this process myself. So I worked in the arts and culture sector in nonprofit theater most of my career, like almost 20 years. And then I went and worked at an environmental NGO, Alberta Eco Trust Foundation. And I had always cared about the environment, but didn't really feel like I had the bandwidth to contribute to it. And then I went and worked at an organization. And I felt like I had a huge learning curve. And I was so concerned that as somebody who came from arts and culture, what do I have to, I ran a theater company, so I ran a nonprofit. That's probably what they're interested in. And then it turns out that they were deeply interested in my work as an artist, deeply interested in the storytelling elements of what I did, deeply interested in the way that I thought and the way that I brought people together, and it surprised me. And then I started to hear from a lot of other artists that I knew about how they were concerned about climate change. They wanted to contribute, but they didn't think they could, or they weren't sure how. And I started to notice certain barriers that would come up. And so the orientation for me was really about how did I encounter some of those barriers myself, and what are the frameworks that I was introduced to through various trainings and various opportunities through that opportunity to be in an environmental NGO that helped me, that spoke to me as an artist and as a dramaturg. And so the orientation is really built around those things that opened up pathways for me to go from information to inspiration, to sort of feel my own understanding of who I was and what I could contribute. And I think some of the barriers that the orientation is designed to address are the feel that the sense that as artists we made, and this I say as artists because that's what we're talking about today, but I think sometimes as people we feel this too. The need to know everything, or to feel like that knowledge gap, that information gap element. I've had a lot of people, a lot of artists, and a lot of people suddenly start to say things like, in terms of how much I know about climate change, I'm probably a 5, like maybe a 4, but I should do a little more reading. And I always go, where did this scale come from? And are you allowed to start talking about climate change or creating art about climate change when you get to a 7.25 out of 10? Or where is this arbitrary sort of sense that we have to be climate scientists in order to engage? The knowledge that we have is that we are living and experiencing a changing world. And it's changing in a range of different ways. There's a complex range of ways that it's changing, not just scientifically or technologically, but socially. There's a lot of things that are connected to the climate crisis and to environmental degradation that are about the way that we live and the way that we interact with each other. And we're experiencing that. So we have the knowledge. We just have to realize that we do and claim it and feel comfortable proceeding. And also that you need to get it right, or that you need to say it all. The urgency and scale of the challenge makes it feel like anything you put out there has to just solve the whole problem. Just whatever play you're going to write needs to just have all the answers, and they need to be airtight. That's impossible. And so that's a real barrier for people. So you don't need to solve everything. No one, I mean, if there was already solutions, there's a range of different solutions. So that pressure to say everything and to say it all right and have an airtight answer for everything, that certainty, that bias towards certainty, that bias towards credibility, which is not about imagining. It feels like it stunts our ability to imagine or to find our own ways into it. There's like some outside force that we're trying to speak to. So a lot of the frameworks and things like that I introduced in the orientation are about cueing and prompting other ways in, and also hopefully putting artists' minds at ease about having to solve it all in the one play that they're writing or solve it all in that piece of music, because we're all solving it all together. Yeah.
It's such a joy, actually, to be able to sit and listen to you guys talk about this stuff landing in practice, because I ended up sort of working primarily in an academic context where I'm trying to find the sort of the concepts and the words and the theories that might put us in a particular direction. But the work that you've both done and that's happening here at the NAC to put this in practice is, it's so exciting for somebody who's typically in an academic context. You often hear the word academic used to mean, that's merely academic now, meaning it's not going to go anywhere in the world. So, ta-da, this is fantastic. One of the ways that I try and describe what I think the challenge is the question of how do you bring the arts to an issue without disenchanting the very power for which the help of art was sought in the first place. And the tendency for that to happen, to shy away from the possibility of magic, to sort of think, no, this is too important to worry about inspiration right now. We have to get something right here. In a sense, is a kind of insecurity about the arts in a context where they're not seen as useful. We live in a world that I think dismisses that part of the good of being together. And so one of the things that I'm often tasked with doing is finding translation language that allows these kinds of processes to show up in places like the IPCC or other sort of technical or managerial contexts, sorting out what we actually need to do to actually solve this problem. And one of the words that's really useful here is the idea of infrastructure, because everybody loves the term infrastructure. And so you go into these meetings and you talk about energy infrastructure, and it sounds like you're doing something very, very important. Or you talk about transportation infrastructure, or you talk about physical infrastructure. And all of these infrastructures are really deeply relevant to being able to build out the climate-friendly world. And nobody questions them at all. And in fact, we sink millions and billions of dollars right now into building the infrastructures that we're going to need. And so the infrastructure that I like to put on the table in those conversations is to say, well, there's one kind of infrastructure that we've paid almost no attention to building at all. And it's the difference between us being able to move into a climate-friendly world or being stuck here just yelling at people for not doing what they're supposed to do. And that's the idea of the symbolic infrastructure. So the infrastructure that helps us build the meanings and the values and the identities, the things that any person needs to be in a world. And what happens typically with sustainability is we never build the symbolic infrastructure of the sustainable world. We build all the other infrastructure, and then we line people up on one side of the gap, and we yell at them to move over into that world while giving them none of the means that they actually need, that we all need to step from one world to another. And so trying to think about what, the work at hand and calibrate it so that it has the importance and the presence that it needs inside these conversations around what does this transformation really entail is to be very almost dogmatic about the importance of symbolic infrastructure. Nobody lives in a place that isn't encompassing their symbolic needs. No one, no human does that. And yet so much of the sustainability challenge has been trying to force people to do that. And then if they don't do it, calling them either stupid or evil or in some way othering them in a way that just creates the kind of climate antagonism that we see in this country and in other countries that are trying to make progress on this issue. And so rather than the arts feeling like they have a marginal role in this, like, well, I guess we could try and do something useful, alongside the really important people like the engineers and the policymakers and the investment bankers, we have to start to be much more audacious about declaring the centrality of the role of the arts and of culture, and really think about it in terms of the need to provide any imagination with the symbolic infrastructure it requires if it's going to inhabit a different world.
And so in relationship, like from your research perspective, where something like Irresistible Neighborhoods as a case study, so like what do you think, like how does something like Irresistible Neighborhoods inform the evolution of like what you talk about, the climate or arts framework, and where do you think that this work is transferable, it's scalable?
Absolutely, both in sort of technical terms and in terms of its outcomes. So a kind of outputs and outcomes analysis. So just learning how to create artistic processes that take an instinct to be involved without a lot of experience and capacity to do that, and to have the kind of techniques that Vicky's been evolving to actually shape that development process, learning to refine that, make it more efficient. How empowering can that get in terms of how we're working with artists to build this sort of activity? So just some of the practical dimensions of this. It's so easy, the climate change and sustainability aren't the only fields that are turning to the arts right now. Everyone is turning to the arts to try and fix their problems, right? Health is doing it, mental health is doing it, social justice is doing it, a lot of finance issues are doing it, community development, climate. So everybody has this amazing instinct that the arts are going to save the world, but it's the sort of danger of kind of knowing that something works without knowing how. And you can, if you have a toddler, they can point to a chainsaw and know that that's for cutting down trees. It doesn't mean that you'd put one in the hands of that child. So the sort of part of what we're doing here is we're figuring out the how. How does this work? How is it that you can start to cultivate these experiences so that the arts can bring their A game to this challenge without disenchanting that power for which the help was sought in the first place? So there's some very practical stuff that we're trying to figure out around the ideas of dramaturgy and the kinds of development processes that this requires. And then there's the actual, the stuff that shows up in the material itself. What are the results of that inspiration? I'm not asking the arts to sort of improve upon photovoltaic cells, but I'm asking the arts to start to think about how we find meaning in a place like that, how we start to feel like we belong in that world. Vicky's got a great story about the one with the horse in the show at Caravan, it was the sort of thing where the audience was what struck me as when you told me this story, not a kind of bunch of climate activists waiting to be told how fabulous their work was. It was a very different kind of demographic, but it was a work that gave them the ability to see themselves in a world that was moving from where they were to where we needed them to go. I guess I've teed up that story. I have to tell it now.
Well, you're going to have to tell that story now, Vicky. Go for it.
I believe David's talking about a production called Black Horse that was composed and written by Linz Kenyon in association with our artistic director Estelle Shook. And this was a summer show we did a couple years ago. We use draft horses in our work, and in this case, 6 large black Percheron horses were used throughout the show as a sort of symbol of fossil fuels and of economy and of progress, that sort of harnessing, and ultimately freedom in that symbolic way. But the actual story of the piece was about a couple that lived in rural British Columbia, and as with many people who live in rural environments, going up to Fort McMurray to work in the oil sands or those sort of extractive industries that we have, natural resource industries and fossil fuel industries, and the pressure that ultimately the economic system was putting on them, and how they were, harnessed to the point of almost falling apart. And so that symbolic way of seeing themselves in the couple, because a lot of them live that life who come and see the show. So they see themselves in the couple, but they also see through the horses, and everybody loves horses, especially around where I now live and work. The horses are, and the symbol is an entryway into thinking about the larger challenge, the larger societal challenge, the larger spiritual challenge of how that economic system has sort of put us in harness.
This is a question for all of you to answer. How can now, we talked about kind of the tension of where kind of the climate change and sustainability lies in kind of the art sector. We talked about the content, and what the tension between artists and to create still the magic and the activism wrapped in one on our stages. So how can curators, programmers, presenters of other, arts organizations, or like our example, theater companies, what are the ways we can contribute to a more impactful role for the arts in the climate crisis? Like, what if there are other artistic directors here right now listening into this panel discussion, and they go like, "What do you want us to do?" What would you answer? What would your answer be? Because as somebody that works, I program. I'm in the business of nurturing artists and their stories. What do I do? How can I be better at all the amazing things that you're talking about? How does that translate in artistic programming? Yeah. Great. Awesome. Create a musical. Noted. Thank you very much.
I would say I would encourage people who are in those roles, programmers, presenters, curators, funders even, to think more critically when they make the choice that they want to do something in their role to have an impact with this issue, to address this issue, to think a bit more critically about what they're programming, who it's for, and in particular, I'm really taken with this idea of the symbolic infrastructure that David talked about, and recognizing that that this, if that's not the role of the arts, I don't know what is. So I would love for people in those roles to think more critically about that, to recognize the opportunity that they have. If you say, okay, I'm going to program something with this theme, really look at how the work is addressing the theme. Is it didactic? Is it information based, or does it actually invite artists and audiences to really bring the full scope of their imagination to the task, to inspire, to ask what if, as opposed to simply presenting what is, to ultimately, and this is, something that I say often about Irresistible Neighborhoods as a whole, what I hope that program will do is to cultivate a sense of belonging for audiences in worlds we are yet to inhabit, and to actually help audiences feel that these worlds are something they want to strive towards, to help bring about, not that they're like a form of utopia, because that doesn't make sense either, and like everyone's going to think very differently about what utopia is to them. So it's not about creating a utopia, but it is about creating hope for the future, creating a sense of being pulled into a future that actually is a place you want to be and a place you want to help create. And because if we can't help audiences imagine those worlds and ultimately see themselves in those worlds and explore those worlds with a kind of, the analogy that the arts, the opportunity of analogy that arts gives them, if we can't do that, then how are we going to build those worlds if we can't imagine them? So, I would, thank you. I would encourage programmers and presenters and curators to really think about that question, think about who's going to come and who's coming to see these shows, and what kind of symbolic infrastructure needs to be created for the people coming to see those shows, and all kinds of people, not just folks who already care about this issue, but all kinds of people, including people who think differently and who have a different relationship. And how can we, ultimately inspire a different relationship with the natural world, a different idea of our place in the natural world. And again, that needs to be something that we pursue for all kinds of people, not just people who think similar to the way we do.
Vicki or David?
Thank you. I'm building on so much of what Judy just said. I think that sense of belonging, like just to sort of highlight that, I think that all of us who run cultural organizations have an opportunity as conveners to up our game as facilitators and hosts for the artists that we're hosting, as well as for the audiences that are coming, in terms of the ability to build in spaces where they can just be together and actually connect with each other. Because the isolation that we have from so many things, each other as a community, the natural world concept, even sometimes concepts of value and meaning, we have an opportunity to bring a group of people together, especially performing artists, or to sort of have a shared experience. So even with something like the radio plays or a podcast, what are the invitations that we have to people to respond to that or contemplate that, or inviting people into contemplation, into asking their own questions or recognizing what they're feeling. I think we can invite more of the experience and heighten that experience to allow for greater connection, which I think allows us to work together more effectively to share our different imaginings and build multiple worlds with each other.
I'm just going to intervene. So, this is great, and a lot of what I'm also hearing is, again, somebody that is focused on creating new work. For example, like we can, as Irresistible Neighborhoods is, we can totally kind of start infusing those principles and those values, those what the orientation for. I guess I'm just wondering, with companies that produce existing works, for example, like Shaw or Stratford comes to us and says, what can we do? And we're saying, it's not just about what you put on stage, it's the mentality, it's how everybody that's working for you and how they carry themselves matter, and that will hopefully seep into the different artistic processes. So I guess I'm just wondering, how can the values that you talk about, that orientation, for example, that you lead, can that be applied to theater companies that are already doing existing work, that are looking at adaptations and translations of Shakespeare or Shaw? Obviously, very specific companies I'm calling out, but yes.
I mean, there is. I think that, and again, I haven't worked in either of these places in any depth. But what is the nature of the conversation around what is in those existing works? And what do those existing works, even if you're doing them in a traditional style, what are they speaking to in today? Like, what is the connection between what is happening on stage in the experience of the lives of the people that are watching it, or the artists? And inviting that question in rehearsal, before rehearsal, after, and really thinking about what how to translate that relevance, even if you're not planning on doing it set in New York City in 2024, you know, Merchant of Venice or whatever. There are elements of nature in those shows. There are elements of discussing poverty and class, and the nature of the conversation around those things. Again, I don't know how those are hosted. I wish I did. I hope they're being hosted. But how do we ensure that we're always connecting and thinking about what is this, when people leave this place, what are they leaving with into the world that they're going into? And really thinking about that question, which I hope is happening. It probably is, but if it isn't, just really ensuring that we are approaching it with that level of thoughtfulness. That's my thought.
I think it's a great task for us to set ourselves, maybe as part of the Irresistible Worlds work, to think about what's a dramaturgical toolkit that can inspire a response to the question that you raise around staging and thinking about existing work within a climate context. I've done a chunk of that work in the classical music world, which has both the impediment and the luxury of typically not having text. And so the question of how you can stage and signify it is in some ways harder and in some ways much easier. But it's still something that sort of spend some time thinking about and working with people who do that in the classical music world, about thinking, what can Beethoven say about the climate crisis, and how do we do that? I don't even really care about doing that in a way that I think Beethoven would be on side with, actually. I think about doing that in the way that the power of Beethoven's music right now can be a participant in. So the question about doing that in textual arts, in something like theater, I think is maybe something that we should set ourselves as that should be an output of Irresistible Neighborhoods, so that is something that we can send to places such as Stratford or Shaw, should they come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, because just from my observations going through Irresistible Neighborhoods, and again, like in speaking with the artists that went through, and some of them are here, hello, and maybe you guys can talk about that, like how to translate, all of that into their artistic practice, but also, again, content, right? Like, what does that mean? And I know, in speaking with my colleagues in kind of the larger Canadian theater community, we're still stuck in this knowledge or information gap, that these values are too intangible to kind of translate into artistic programming, that lens, that eye. But what heartens me is that, like, everything that we're striving to do, every good thing that we feel like arts can do to inspire folks, that is already like environmental change. And we are already contributing, actively contributing, and addressing the crisis, which is liberating in many ways.
Something that I think can sort of strengthen the thing that you're talking about, that we've done in the past, where we're talking about art as the power of art to be transformational in people's lives. And we ask people, tell me a time in which you had an experience with art that you would describe as transformative, where the world became a different place, or you became a different person as a result of a movie that you saw, or a book that you read, or a painting that you stood in front of. And just asking people to answer that question. I've asked that question in a lot of different places, and I've never, ever had somebody say Sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Everybody has at least one really rich answer that they give to that question, where the arts have completely changed their sense of themselves or their sense of the world. And so when you look at, well, tell me about those experiences, it's never something that they learned, right? It's not, and then I knew something different, it's these sort of deeper changes. So it helps kind of calibrate what we're aiming for at a descriptive level than when we try and turn around and do it in practice.
Great. So I want to open the floor for any questions from the audiences. Let's have a discussion. So I think Sean, our trusty microphone runner, please raise your hand and we'll come to you and ask away.
Thanks very much for a very, very thought-provoking discussion. I really, really enjoyed everything I heard. I work at the University of Ottawa, and I'm currently teaching a seminar on culture for hope. And though I have a very self-interested question, Judy, you actually mentioned the word hope as a key term. And my question is, what role can the arts play in fostering hope, especially when it comes to the climate crisis and the hopelessness that often is felt in that context? Is that a key role that the arts can play? And what kind of critical, active hope do we need to be fostered by the arts to make a difference? Not a kind of blind hope or one that leaves everything as is.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say absolutely the arts have not only the opportunity, but I would argue even the responsibility to inspire hope. Anyone who has any kind of media diet, mainstream media, social media, like there's so much bad news out there. There is cause for despair and there is cause for grief, and I don't want to belittle that. But when you sit in it for a long time, it can fill you with so much despair that it becomes paralyzing. And we cannot afford for that to happen, either individually or collectively. And I think, equally the arts has a responsibility not to be Pollyanna, not to, gloss over the very real grief for our environment and many other issues and human suffering and, non-human suffering. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that our responsibility in this space is, at least part of our responsibility, is to help people come out of that paralysis. And the media is, I believe, like very skewed, and what gets reported is only a tiny fraction of what actually happens in the world, and far more bad news tends to get reported because it happens more quickly than good news. And all of this contributes to the kind of paralysis that a lot of people feel, and we can't afford that paralysis. So I do feel strongly that the arts has a responsibility to get that balance right. Like, again, not to gloss over the grief, but to also help lift people out of that grief into a place of action.
May I as well? I also think one of the things that the arts can offer is the knowledge that you are not alone, that there are other people that care enough to be sitting here and listening to this, or sitting in an audience, and in that there's the act of bringing people together around culture and acknowledging that culture is shared, that reminds us that we're not alone. But there's also a myriad of different stories. I think when we look to the future, sometimes we hear a particular sort of dystopian story or a sort of techno-utopian story that doesn't really have any people in it. So the idea of there's a range of different types of story and different types of people that live in the world of the future, and we see ourselves in those people. So we are not alone, and we see ourselves. So that sense of, again, coming back to belonging, I feel like belonging and connection brings a hope that isolation doesn't. And so that's something that we have the opportunity for.
I'd be interested in just, I have no confidence in this answer at all, so it's just conjecture, but how easy it is to tell people to be hopeful or to be less hopeful or more hopeful, and wonder how much hope is sort of an outcome or a byproduct of a different suite of things where we do have more agency or leverage over, whether that's a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl's work on meaning, for example, and the difference, the sort of hope versus hopelessness. This is a Holocaust survivor who went on to become a prominent psychoanalyst, but the contingent that was so influential for him about whether somebody survived or not, and had that sense of hope or hopefulness, was not whether somebody was trying to make them hopeful in the kind of context that that person was in, but whether they had a sense of meaning that was guiding what they were doing. And the question of whether actually meaning has much greater leverage and we have much greater agency over creating meaning than we do over creating hope. I don't know, I'm just sort of thinking out loud there.
Thank you. Round of applause for our amazing panelists. We're at the conclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today. You've heard Irresistible Neighborhoods in this panel. Please, I hope folks haven't seen it. We have 2 p.m. Showing of Walking on Water, our double bill of radio plays. Please join us at the 4th stage. Thank you again for sharing your afternoon with us for this riveting conversation. I hope you folks will enjoy the sun for a little bit before heading into the dark space in 4th stage, and feeling inspired and hopeful, if I will use that word. Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you.